mid-19th century, a handful of visionaries embarked on a quest to change the world forever, involving some of the greatest minds of the era, finance on an unimaginable scale, and radical new breakthroughs in engineering and technology. Their goal was to physically link the two mightiest nations on Earth across thousands of miles of ocean. In a single stroke, they would slash communication times between Britain and America from weeks to minutes. Amongst those who made this astonishing feat possible was one of the greatest scientific minds of his day, an Ulsterman, William Thomson, later known as Lord Kelvin. This is the story of the man who shrank the world. This is the story of Kelvin's cable. Today we live in an age of communication, where information, images and data are transmitted in the blink of an eye all around the globe. Far from being astonished by this capability, we simply take it for granted, each and every day. If, like me, you're old enough to remember life before emails, the internet, and instant messages, it is still hard to imagine that until relatively recently, a message sent overseas could only travel as fast as it could be physically carried. Nowhere was this problem more apparent than in mid-1850s Britain, when it came to keeping in touch with our cousins across the Atlantic in the New World. For news of America to reach British ears, or vice versa, meant a minimum 10-day journey by steamship. Even the most basic dialogue took weeks or months to complete. But this was about to change forever. The Victorian age had already witnessed one revolution, fueled by the power of steam. As a direct result, the pace of transport, industry and life in general had begun to increase rapidly. It becomes a culture of speed, a marketable commodity. So shrinking the world was part of the rhetoric of the new age of steam.
The need for communication and a fast means of communication around the world was becoming ever more evident, because you had colonies, you had empires, you had newly forming trade routes, and information had to be passed at a rate that made it useful.
So it had already been done between Britain and France, and it had been done within countries using telegraphs, but to be able to connect Britain and America in that way was so important, and that's really why the transatlantic cable project was such a big deal.
I think all of us know that the world today is almost literally bound up like a Christmas present by fiber optic cables, many of them around the world. That all began more than 150 years ago.
With pioneers on both sides of the Atlantic experimenting with the newfangled technology of the electric telegraph, the American inventor Samuel Morse transmitted his first official message in 1844 along 38 miles of wire connecting Washington to Baltimore. Traveling at the unheard of speed of 30 characters a minute, or 1 every 2 seconds, Morse's historic message simply read, "What hath God wrought?" Despite that rather ominous first note, the electric telegraph spread like wildfire, and soon much of the landmass of the civilized world was crisscrossed with the wires of this wonderful new invention. And yet, despite the phenomenal impact the telegraph would have on the world, the technology behind it was relatively straightforward.
So this is a very simple electrical telegraph circuit, and what we've got here is a source of electricity, which are these batteries. We have something that will detect that there's electricity flowing, which are these bulbs, and then we have a way of switching on and off the electricity, which is this key here. And this is really a very simple way of using an electrical current to produce a signal. In this case, these bulbs either being on or off. And that's really the concept of an electrical telegraph. These wires could be travelling from one village to another, so you'll be able to do this over some distance. However, it's all very well being able to switch bulbs on and off like that, but in order to send a message you really need some sort of code. And that's where Samuel Morse came in. He developed a code depending on whether the bulbs were on for a long time or for a short time. So he called those dashes and dots. And the sequence of dashes and dots together corresponded to different letters of the alphabet. So a skilled telegrapher would be able to send messages using these sequences of dashes and dots, and therefore transmit messages from one place to another. And that's really the concept of an electrical telegraph.
Electricity, like steam before it, soon began to shrink the world, and the new network of railway tracks provided an easy path for the telegraph wires to follow. But while steam had conquered both the land and the sea, once the electric telegraph reached the coast, it was literally the end of the line. All news had to continue its journey from there by ship. By the mid-1800s, some visionaries had dared to dream of a cable spanning even the Atlantic Ocean. One such man was Cyrus Field, a successful New York entrepreneur in his early 30s, who was enjoying retirement, having made an absolute fortune in the paper business. As he stared at the globe in his study one day, Field traced a line from Newfoundland, the most easterly point on the North American continent, across thousands of miles of Atlantic Ocean, until his finger happened across the nearest piece of European soil, which turned out to be Valentia, a tiny island off the south coast of Ireland. Field knew nothing of electricity or telegraph technology, but he knew that time is money, and so in the bold spirit of the age, he set about recruiting other equally unqualified American millionaires to share in his venture. Collectively, they became known as the Atlantic Cable Projectors, and in 1854, they founded the New York, Newfoundland and London Telegraph Company, with the express purpose of laying a working telegraph cable across the Atlantic. For its day, and given Field's complete lack of technical expertise, it was as bold a statement of ambition as that of President Kennedy a century later to put a man on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We're go, hang tight, we're go. Tranquility base here. The Eagle has landed.
They were reaching beyond the technology that was available, and it's really remarkable that sometimes you get an idea and you pursue it, and it actually works, sort of, or it works closely enough so that you can go on. And that's what happened here, because the technology was barely available to them.
Very ambitious project for sure. A lot of the key physical constraints were really challenging. You had all the North Atlantic weather to contend with. You had probably a seabed that really hadn't been charted or mapped at that time. None of these technologies were available.
So it drove engineering to the limit, but also from an electrical point of view, the process of sending a signal from one side of the Atlantic to the other was electrically very challenging.
The success of this Victorian information superhighway would be due in no small part to the Belfast-born scientist whose name is perhaps a little less well known than it deserves to be. Even here in the city where he was born, people walking past his statue pay him very little attention, if they even know who he is. But in the world of science, he's is numbered amongst the very greatest of physicists. Known to history as Lord Kelvin of Largs, his given name was William Thomson. From the very earliest age, young Thomson's path towards academia was influenced by his father, James Thomson, the son of an Ulster Scots farmer. Through sheer determination, James had worked his way up to the position of Professor of Mathematics at Belfast Royal Academical Institution. When the death of his wife left him with 6 children to look after, he also personally undertook the homeschooling of his eldest sons, including young William.
The leading characteristic of James Thomson Sr. and the children, including William especially, is that the worst sin in life is waste. Useful work is the key to their entire lives. Their life is like an allocation from God, and every minute of that life has to be occupied not wasting their time, but performing useful work.
Spurred on by this most Presbyterian of work ethics, William's father attained even greater academic heights in 1832, when he was appointed to the chair of mathematics at the University of Glasgow. Along with his older brother James, William Thomson entered university life here in Glasgow, the city that was to play such a profound role in his own story. At the time, he was all of 10 years old.
Seemingly in those days it was quite normal for kids with ability to get opportunities to join university. So at the age of 10 he actually began studying at Glasgow University, which would seem quite amazing nowadays. But within 2 years he was publishing papers and winning prizes already in some of his investigations and some of his work. So quite quickly he began to show that the investment in time and effort was paying off.
At 22, the future Lord Kelvin became Professor of Natural Philosophy at Glasgow University, marking the beginning of a half-century of scientific achievement.
If you go on the internet and look up, say, Wikipedia, you will find the longest list of achievements for anybody that I've ever found. The man was just across so many fields.
Well, Kelvin did a lot of work on energy and particularly the relationship between mechanical energy and heat energy. And that was pioneering stuff.
And he and his colleagues created a new branch of physics called thermodynamics. In fact, he coined the phrase thermodynamics.
Kelvin, the unit of temperature, is named after him. He arrived at the concept of having an absolute zero of temperature. But he was also a very good applied scientist. He was essentially an inventor.
The mariner's compass, as reinvented really by Kelvin in his own time, was a very famous artifact of the 19th century and even into the 20th century. Secondly, his work focused on electricity and magnetism, and that, of course, links in with the telegraphic industry very much.
Naturally, this expertise brought him to the attention of Cyrus Field, and so it was that in 1857, Thomson was invited to join the Atlantic Cable Company's growing list of directors. To look after the technical side of things, however, Field engaged the services of the fantastically named Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse as the project's chief electrician. Almost immediately, the two experts began to clash over their fiercely opposing scientific views. Innocently enough, all Thomson had done initially was to publish a few scientific theories about how electricity behaves in long-distance submerged cables and how those cables might be specifically designed for that purpose. Whitehouse, who was mostly self-taught through experiments, took that as a personal slight and launched a series of public counterattacks. Of course, it's just possible that Whitehouse was feeling a little defensive, given that he had trained not as a scientist, but as a surgeon.
Whitehouse and Thomson disagreed on how the cable should be designed. So there were experiments that had been done by Whitehouse, but they were using fairly short lengths of cable and done in the lab, and to try and extrapolate that to the problem of the transatlantic cable run, the 2,500-mile run, was something that Whitehouse didn't really have the ability to do, whereas Thomson's mathematical background in analysing the problem from that standpoint was a much more effective and reliable way.
The essence of this disagreement centered on how the cable should cope with an electrical phenomenon known as retardation.
So what we've got here is a setup that illustrates the problem that telegraphers had when the cables became very, very long. This device here is going to produce effectively the same thing as I would do if I tapped the Morse key very, very quickly. And we've got two cables here. We've got a fairly short black cable, and then we've got a much longer blue cable wound into a drum, in fact. And what you can see here is that the short black cable produces very nice, clean on-off signals. But when we plug the blue cable in, which is in this case 40 meters long, you can see two things happen. First of all, the signal becomes smeared out, and it's not actually as large a signal, so it's attenuated. And the problem that the long-distance telegraphers had was the transatlantic cable wasn't 40 meters long, it was 4,000 kilometers long, so these problems became 100,000 times worse.
But with public interest and financial pressure mounting, the company ignored Thomson's theoretical reservations and pressed ahead with Whitehouse's cheaper, thinner, and ultimately inferior design.
So I have here a sample of the original transatlantic cable. This cable is barely wider than the width of my thumb, so you can really see the engineering challenge that this posed. Now, this cable was based on Whitehouse's original design, and there were a couple of features of this that Thomson had reservations on. One of them was the smallness of the core here, because that made it very difficult to send a signal all the way through the cable and be detected at the other end. The other was around the basic integrity of the copper, because the purer the copper was, the easier the electrical signal would travel through it.
Even Whitehouse's cheaper design still cost £225,000 to manufacture, equivalent to almost £16 million today. And at more than a tonne per mile, the full cable weighed over 2,500 tons. No ship in existence could carry such a load, but the solution was simple. They used two. The British HMS Agamemnon and the American USS Niagara would each carry 1/2 of the massive cable. It still took 30 men 3 weeks to load each ship, but in August 1857, off the southern tip of Ireland, the two ships anchored side by side, and the separate halves were joined and tested. As the signal flowed successfully through the 2,500 miles of cable, everyone involved must have breathed a huge sigh of relief. One end was brought ashore on Valentia Island, and the two ships began their expedition to Newfoundland with the cable paying out from behind the Niagara. Among those on board were Cyrus Field, Samuel Morse, and our own William Thomson. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking it was just a simple matter of spooling out the cable as they went, but as they were soon to discover, there's a little more to it than that. As the cable pays out from the back of the ship, two forces tug on it, creating tension. First, there's the pull of the water on the cable from the forward motion of the ship. Then there's the physical weight of the actual cable itself. It starts out easily enough in the shallow waters near the coast, but as the sea becomes deeper, those forces increase rapidly, pulling on the cable. To counter that, they had a braking mechanism, of course, but applying this created even more tension in the cable. and with the ocean floor of the Atlantic as much as 2.5 miles below, it wasn't long before the inevitable happened. Suddenly, 400 miles out to sea, the cable snapped and was lost forever in the depths of the Atlantic. There was no way to retrieve the lost cable, but despite the cost, the intrepid projectors simply manufactured more and tried again.
The first attempt at spanning the Atlantic had been very much based on a play out the cable from one side and head straight across. That was unfortunately a failure, and then they adopted a new approach to join the two ships in the middle, splice the cable, and then play out the cable as both of them moved to their respective shores.
Their efforts were hampered by storms, passing icebergs, and even inquisitive whales. But on the 5th of August, 1858, exactly a year after the first attempt, the cable from the Agamemnon came ashore at Valentia, stretching all the way back to the Niagara at Newfoundland. As the messages began to flow, there was a flurry of excitement on both sides of the Atlantic, with firework displays and a 100-gun salute in New York. Queen Victoria telegraphed her congratulations to the US President, James Buchanan, himself a man of Ulster Scots heritage. But the celebrations were to be short-lived.
Over a course of days, the rate of signalling declined, so the health of the cable was not good.
Queen Victoria's message was getting there at the rate of 0.1 words per minute. So her original message of congratulations to the US took 16 hours to cross. So it was by no means anywhere within the current thinking of what speed of light communication is.
They didn't have the instruments yet to receive these very feeble messages, the signals that came across. Indeed, they didn't understand what was happening in the cable to the signal.
So the tiny signals coming out of the end of the transatlantic cable really tested Thomson's inventiveness to the limit. He came up with solutions to detect those tiny signals, and one of them, the mirror galvanometer, we have a display version of here. And basically what this does is it detects very small amounts of electricity, just enough to move the needle of that meter. Now you could make that needle much bigger, but that would make it much more difficult mechanically to move. Thomson's inventive step was to shine a beam of light off a little mirror attached to the base of the needle and project that on a wall. So by doing that, you would see a much bigger effect for a small signal.
Now in a state of near panic, however, Whitehouse rejected Thomson's elegant solution and opted for something altogether more brutal.
He started to use devices like these. This is an induction coil which produces thousands of volts, and he used induction coils like this to increase the signal going into the cable. But the problem with doing that was that these devices are so powerful, actually what he was doing, without realizing it perhaps, was burning away the insulation of the cable itself.
Inevitably, just weeks after the first message was sent, the cable spoke no more. This was a crushing blow to everyone involved in the Atlantic Cable project, but for Whitehouse in particular, it was an instant career killer. With his reputation in shreds, he was ignominiously dumped as the chief electrician. And even worse, he was soon replaced by his arch-rival, the now exonerated William Thomson.
And then they had to begin thinking, so where do we go from here? And how do we sort of build in the back this? But it was going to take a period of some 8 years before they would be able to ultimately have a successful retry at bridging the Atlantic.
It's amazing that they got as far as they did. And what's even more amazing is that having failed in 1858, that they were able to come back and say, well, all right, we dumped a lot of money into the Atlantic, but we can now raise some more money and we can go back and do it again. And they did.
With the silence of the previous failure still ringing in investors' ears, Field sold his interest in the paper trade and put his remaining finances and efforts into the Atlantic cable. Even so, the whole project could still have been abandoned had it not been for the advent of another colossal achievement of the Victorian age. Built by engineering genius Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the 22,500-ton Great Eastern was quite simply the world's largest ship by far, and would remain so for almost half a century. If you were to stand it upright on its stern, the Great Eastern would have been 70 stories high. That's 3 times the length of this elegant vessel behind me. It was so massive that its construction actually drove up the global price of iron. And it was such an immense undertaking and took such a toll on Brunel's health that shortly before its maiden voyage, at the age of 51, he collapsed and died. Just before his untimely demise, however, the great engineer had given Cyrus Field a tour of the enormous vessel, telling him, "Here is the ship, to lay your cable." All that was needed now was a cable as mighty as the Great Eastern itself.
So by comparison, this is actually a sample of the cable that Thomson designed for the later cable-laying expeditions. And this is much better in various ways. It's got much more armoury, so it's more robust. It was easier to lay without breaking it. But it also has a much thicker core, which lets the electricity flow through it much more easily. It's got more insulation. So overall, this was the cable that would lead to the success of the project.
The now mainly British-funded project had a purpose-built cable, the largest ship on Earth, and a new wave of optimism and expertise behind it. Surely this time, the Atlantic would be conquered at last. I would love to tell you this new improved venture was a complete success, but alas, no. This time they got almost all the way, but once again, the cable snapped. It took another 12 months and another 2,500 miles of shiny new cable. But in July 1866, after a departure that fell on Friday the 13th, their luck and the cable finally held. Almost a decade after her previous message to the US President, Queen Victoria sent another, this time to Andrew Johnston, who coincidentally was also of Ulster Scots heritage. But the Ulsterman who would receive the lion's share of national recognition and royal reward was William Thomson.
The success of the 1866 cable meant a big elevation in status, in social status for William Thomson.
Queen Victoria knighted him for all his efforts, and subsequently he became the first British scientist to be elevated to the House of Lords as well.
So he'd come a long way from the origins in Belfast, and it was clearly linked to a project which took on national importance.
Hailed by the Times as the most wonderful achievement of this victorious century, Kelvin's cable signalled the arrival of a communications revolution. A full 10 years before Alexander Graham Bell made the very first phone call, information could now flow freely and almost instantaneously between the two mightiest nations on Earth.
It was really important, especially to commerce. It connected the markets in New York and Chicago with those in Liverpool and Paris and so forth.
Prices of raw materials, particularly cotton prices, both in the United States and also in India, were communicated by cable.
Within another 6-7 years, all of the major countries of the world were joined by these cables.
Countries as far apart as Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, even across the Pacific by the 1890s.
There's a complete chain of developments right across the world from those early scientific days. You had the land telegraph, you had the submarine cable, you had radio and TV, the second generation of information, and now you have the digital information revolution that's happening.
we have the internet, we have all sorts of ways of sending messages to one another almost instantaneously. But that's part of a story, and I think Kelvin's contribution at the beginning of that story was pretty pioneering and pretty fundamental, so, you know, we shouldn't forget that.
Next tonight on BBC4, two teams that floundered in the first round get another chance to advance. Victoria Corin Mitchell adjudicates the fight for survival in Only Connect next. Then at 9, a body in a quarry lake raises some unsettling questions for DCI Matthias in Hinterland. Stay with us.